This week our topic is on reporting and public relations. And if your project or program was funded by any source, whether it be private or public, someone's going to want to know, how did it go? Did we spend our money wisely? And you will need to report on what happened, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent. And that oftentimes you'll have this reporting inside of the agency or the organization that you work for. But there's that group of stakeholders, and many of you discussed that as an important group when you were looking at the betterevaluation.org website. The stakeholders that want to see your program be successful are also interested in the results. So you'll take what you found out and report it to your agency, oftentimes accounting for the financial spending on each one of the outputs and the outcomes. But then you'll have to turn that into something that becomes more public and serves the purpose of the stakeholder. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today and show you a couple of different ways to use the resources I've provided. The first resource you're reading this week is, again, from the SciFar group, and this is reviewing the data and then reporting on the data. This is the menu for reporting on the data. And it gives you some good little segues into things you want to consider for the report. Create a presentation plan, select reporting method, use graphics. These graphics continue different ways of using graphics. And then your reporting methods and some additional resources. And I ask you about which one of these you would use in terms of reporting the type of communication that you would use to report your type of project. And quite honestly, this site leaves out what I think are some really good ways to report in what I would call the 21st century kind of ways to report, which is looking at some of your social networks and so forth. We'll look at that in just a minute. So this then goes into, whoops, I clicked on the link, 7, communication and evaluation results. And those communication results, communicating those results is what's really going to be important in that particular module that you're looking at. Okay, so there's a fine line between education, advocacy, marketing, and public relations. You know, education is something that we are going to hopefully approach in somewhat of a non-biased way. We're going to hopefully look at it in terms of understanding concepts, supported by a current body of knowledge. We're looking at that in terms of remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating, and this is Bloom's taxonomy, and I encourage many of you to use this in your objectives because it helps you to measure what's going on. There's the taxonomy verbs, which I shared with you before, for measuring what happened here in terms of a current body of knowledge. It should be approached with just being non-biased, just the matter of fact, not trying to put any spin on something. However, when you take a look at advocacy, you are actually proactively supporting a cause. That could be important in the project that you have, but it may not be. In fact, it may be considered a biased approach to the project or research, causing people to discount what you did as a result. So education is what we find out in terms of facts and knowledge, but then we turn them around and we start to advocate and support a particular cause with different kinds of energies or media outputs. We've maybe gone off that line. We've crossed over the line from being education to now we're advocating for something, maybe based on the education, the findings that we have. Fine line between those two. Then there's marketing, where you put out the efforts and resource to sell your product and service. So now you've changed it up. You're not just advocating, you're putting out resources to really sell your message. It may not be a product, but a service or a message, and that's marketing. And then the last one here, public relations. That's done to build a trusted relationship. So, and that would happen when you're advocating. That would happen oftentimes when you're trying to market, but not necessarily when you're trying to educate. You still have those stakeholders, you want to have a relationship with them, but at the end of the day, you are interested really with just the facts of really what happened in this case in an intervention or a program that you have planned and prepared. So those are some terms I want you to say that are not synonymous, but that they have their own meaning, and they have their own meaning inside of reporting. So a source for quick information without engaging your marketing department or earning your MBA, if you need to do those latter two, which is public relations and marketing, one of my favorite go-to texts is Public Relations for Dummies. Now there are a lot of textbooks, magazines, websites, periodicals, but quite honestly, I ran across this book a couple of years ago, and they, of course, do for dummies lots of things, but they are good at capturing a synopsis. So if you need to do something quick, to market a particular program or get a particular message out there, put some spin on something that you need support for, this is a really good resource. And I know right now you're thinking, Spielmaker's crazy, academics using books for dummies. Well, they're really good at grabbing the really important bare bones information that you need to move ahead. Communicating that project then, in the SciFAR modules, they talk about things that I would consider very traditional. Things like writing a report, mailing it out, printing it out. They talk about charts and graphs and getting that really very much in a print way. But all of that thing can be turned into an electronic or a digital version that can go online, but then can have its own life outside on social media, where maybe your stakeholders and even your funders, if the agencies that you're working with are also seeing it. I mean, Utah State University has tons of social media, and when something happened that's a big impact from somebody's project, it gets spun out on social media. Talking about doing things with Instagram, Pinterest, blogs, YouTube. Before I go on let me back up here a little bit. Blogs were really, really popular, and then they kind of fell off the chart. People weren't really following them. And now, in the last, I would say, couple of years, they've become a little bit more popular now, because people can do quick links to them through things like Instagram or through Twitter, and link back to something for more detail. So they've actually become a little more popular. But quite honestly, people want things pretty quickly. YouTube is nice because it's visual. If you have something visual about a project, you can put together a quick video. In fact, if it's quick enough, less than a minute, something sped up, something with cool graphics, you can spin it out to your other social media like Facebook and Twitter, and then it has another life of its own. It just starts to snowball, using this as a pretty effective means for communication. And there's lots of researchers, a growing and large body already of research about how social media, even though we like to think of it as truly social and not something to do with the world of work, is completely integrated with the world of work now, and linking up people with the different sorts of communication about projects and programs. Finally, I think I got one more here. Snapchat. So Snapchat is kind of ephemeral and quick, and if you use it, it's not as effective because it's ephemeral and quick. But it is something that younger folks tend to use, and it can be something that's quick depending on your audience. And that's the other thing to consider. I'm not going to go too much into that in this course, but each one of these has their own type of following, and that's why so many web pages that are public, like Utah State University or any organization, even .govs or .uts or .us sorts of locations, have all social media links on their websites to communicate to the public, their stakeholders, what's been going on. So communication tools, the internet growing, it's not shrinking. A while back there used to be a commercial that talked about I've reached the end of the internet. Not happening. It's just going to continue to grow worldwide. Mobile devices, I just looked up this information. 92% of adults in the United States own a mobile device, so they can quickly access data. Smartphones, and this is off the Pew Research Center, and I've provided the website here below on the Huffington Post. Think smartphones hurt socialization, but we use them anyway. This was a really nice big report on cell phone use, but cell phone owners under 50 rarely turn their phones off. And I thought this was an interesting statistic or graphic that they had in that report. Any of you who have grandparents or even parents that are well over 50, they turn theirs off. They turn them off and they charge them up, and they have regular phones in their house, landlines. But cell owners under 50 don't turn them off. They leave them on. They're charging. They're there all the time for quick access. This website also had some neat statistics about how often we check social media, and it's often. Depending on your demographic, you're quickly grabbing it, you're getting notifications. So if you are communicating the results to stakeholders who kind of follow you, they're following you with your Twitter or Facebook feeds, they're going to see that information, and that's why it becomes important to have your reports in a quick consumable way to meet the needs of that user. Now, there's a lot of text on this page, but I wanted to really highlight a couple of things here. Outcome harvesting. I put this on here because many of you mentioned it in the week 12 post as something you found interesting on the betterevaluation.org website. See if I can grab a hold of things here. But unlike some evaluation approaches, and we all know about outcomes, this is part of your logic model. But outcome harvesting does not measure the progress towards the predetermined objective or outcome, but rather collects evidence of what has changed, and then working backwards determines whether and how the intervention contributed to these changes. So it's a different way to really get a think tank on it and start looking in and delving deeper into the actual outcome to collect evidence to see what it is that really resulted in that change. It determines whether and how the intervention contributed to these changes. The outcome can be positive or negative. Keep that in mind. Sometimes students are worried, what if my research finds out that this isn't really good? That's still an important finding. You need to report it. That's part of research. Whether it's intended or unintended, direct or indirect, but the connection between the intervention and the outcome should be plausible. Like, is this really possible that our intervention is contributing to this particular outcome? Now, they're talking about this in a very qualitative way, but we have quantitative ways to do this, and it's looking for statistical significance on an outcome. So they were talking about a very qualitative, going back, and some of the examples, keep in mind that was a global site for evaluation. But more often, we are looking for some quantitative results using inferential statistics here. And those inferential statistics help us to see if there's statistical significance, and then we can talk about practical significance. So outcome harvesting, while we like to think of it as we can go back and look at what everything is individually, think of outcome harvesting, and if you've got quantitative data, as looking for statistical significance in the way you set it up and analyze it on a particular outcome. Now I'm going to move on to outcome mapping. Oh, that one should have been down here by itself. But outcome mapping is a methodology for planning, monitoring, and evaluating the development of initiatives in order to bring about sustainable social change. So many of you talked about outcome mapping and outcome harvesting, and I wanted to highlight them because you talked about them, but also because to draw attention to the fact that they are different, even though they sound similar. As the name suggests, it is a niche of understanding the outcomes, the so-called missing middle or black box of results that emerge downstream from the initiative's activities, but upstream from a longer-term economic, environmental, political, and demographic changes. So outcome mapping is really when you can do a longitudinal look at what's taken place and work, in a sense, backwards to say, oh, was that outcome a result, and are we seeing that now longitudinally having this social impact, economic, environmental, political, or demographic changes? So they're slightly different. Both of them would be related to your logic model, but this one is going to collect evidence, and you'll be able to do it with a short-term plan and quantitatively if you've collected that data. This one is more long-term, and you're looking back to see how that particular outcome was reached. It's a way to understand that outcome. It's that missing middle, and oftentimes it will be completely related on qualitative data. So two good things that you all liked taking a look at in terms of approaches. Turning evaluation to reporting on better evaluation also had these other three that you talked about. Looking at the most significant change. That's the approach that involves generating and analyzing personal accounts. Qualitative again, and deciding which of these accounts is most significant and why. If you have quantitative data, that's pretty easy to check for statistical significance. There's the other term that we use in statistics called effect size, and there's been some formulas out to calculate effect size, and that tells us, did we move the needle enough? Did it have a small effect, medium effect, large effect? But when you have only qualitative data, you're looking for analyzing these personal accounts. And so that becomes another thing to look at with the qualitative information. That site, again, is a global site. And so they oftentimes are looking at global programs, and they're collecting what sometimes we would call anecdotal information, but they're the real stories telling us why in a qualitative approach. Organization, performance, and evaluation. A lot of you looked at this and said, I think this is a really good way. And by the way, this is not spelled wrong. It's a direct quote from there, and they're using, I suppose, the Queen's English to substitute Z's and S's and put E's on the end of things that we typically wouldn't see here in the U.S. But an organizational assessment is a systematic process for obtaining valid information about the performance of an organization and the factors that affect the performance. So this is going back to when we're monitoring the program and we're doing the evaluation. Is it being executed? And I thought it was interesting that a lot of you pulled this out. A lot of you plan to work for Extension, or you might currently work for Extension. I think this is a very good self-reflective process, and probably something that Extension needs to go through in a very rigorous way as we go through the 21st century and sort of change programs up for the culture we have with the types of communication resources that we have to communicate educational programming, which so often is probably 90% of the programming that we do is educational. So this, I think, could be a really good thing for at least Extension, or even many organizations that have been doing business as usual that maybe need to look at making some changes. Finally, the one, and they had so many on that website, but finally the other one that a lot of you talked about, and I was glad because that was my topic for this week, was impact evaluation. An impact evaluation provides information about the impacts produced by an intervention, positive and negative, that's important, intended, unintended, direct and indirect. This means that an impact evaluation must establish what has been the cause observed, changes in the case for impact. And we refer to this as a causal attribution. Now, one thing that was interesting is on that site, they're making sure that you understand it has to be linked to the cause. Well, we need to have some pretty good, statistical significance at the 0.01 or certainly the 0.05, so that we can say there's less than a 1% chance that something else caused this effect, or less than a 5% chance that something else caused this effect. And that's when statistical significance can really help us using quantitative data, and then also have a qualitative story to kind of tell us why. So impact evaluation is where you're going to be spending a little bit more time this week. And in fact, I'm going to jump out here to a website. You're going to be looking at the multi-state research. And I went to a workshop a few weeks ago. I may have mentioned this in a previous recording, but USDA requires in their reporting that you generate an Extension as well, impact statements. So I provided for you this week a link to the multi-state research, and not because the topic is going to work for every one of you, but because it shows you what impact statements look like after you do the project. So pick some topics, take a look, take a deep dive. Notice that they all put graphics, and they just sum up what would be in a report that's maybe 8 to 20 pages long, what really happened as a result of this particular project or intervention. They have listed on the side various universities who have contributed and made these impact statements. And then on the side here, you can click through, and if you find a topic that's important to you, you can take a look at that to see how a program and what they designed as their impact. You can also go around here a little bit and look at what impacts mean, but essentially it's talking about, did we change, if you remember the Bennett's model, knowledge, attitudes, skills, aspirations, behaviors in terms of performance, those kinds of things that we talked about with Bennett's hierarchy are part of what you put into an impact statement. If you didn't move the needle on the CASA and you just actually had outputs, you really didn't have an impact. So keep that in mind, because the discussion question this week, I ask you to write what you think would be the most awesome impact statement for the project that you folks are putting together. So you can embellish and you can live a little, be realistic, but put together something that you think, gosh, if I could write an impact statement, and these are quite lengthy, I just want you to write kind of one bare bone paragraph inside of the discussion this week, because it'll get too long. But I want you to be familiar with this, because this is going to be required if you work with any projects or programs and you have to do reporting both to stakeholders and back to your agency, so they know that what they gave you funding to do actually took place. Well, that's my overview for this week on reporting and public relations. I'm looking forward to seeing what you find in terms of the way you're planning to communicate your results, and also the type of impact statement that you're going to generate.